As I introduced myself yesterday, Diane Menashe on behalf of Matt Moore, my co-counsel, Alexander Petrello. The state, I just listened to them for about 30 minutes, and they told you their theory. Their theory is that Matt Moore killed his wife. Don't know when, but Matt Moore kills his wife, and then somehow gets her body into the wooded area where you walked yesterday and stages her death. And then I heard the state go on to say that their evidence will show how not just was he that sophisticated to figure out those two things, but he then also took great efforts to control the situation after May 24th and May 25th of 2020. Members of the jury, the evidence will show that the state's theory is based on speculation and inferences. It is not supported by the evidence. And simply, members of the jury, their theory doesn't make sense. Now, I know you were listening to the state's opening just as well as I was, and the judge has already told you that our opening statements are not evidence. They are just how we believe the evidence will unfold. But I say this, that in my 30-some minutes of listening to the state's argument, I noted that they didn't mention reasonable doubt. That is their burden. Their burden is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And we talked about that in voir dire. It's their burden and their burden alone. And the judge has already given you the instructions of law, and he will again, which say, if the state fails to meet their burden, then the only appropriate verdict as to each of the 3 counts in this case is not guilty. And here's why I mention reasonable doubt, and that they didn't mention it. Is because, as the judge has told you, and as I talked about in voir dire, reasonable doubt is a doubt based on reason and common sense. And so I want to talk about this morning during my opening statement as to why it doesn't make sense that Mathew Moore, and I'll call him Matt, that Matt killed his wife Emily and then staged her suicide. First, members of the jury, the evidence will show there's no physical evidence. You will hear evidence the state will put on, we anticipate, that law enforcement extensively searched the area of 46 Abbey Cross. Not just Westerville Police Departments, but the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigations was brought in. A unit whose sole job, members of the jury, is to look for forensics. They're there too. And it's not just the house. And when I say the house, members of the jury, the evidence will show that they searched the entire perimeter area. But the evidence will also show that exhaustively and extensively they searched the Ultima, they searched the Subaru, they searched the attic, with Matt's permission, by the way, did they do all these searches. They searched the bedding, the sheets that were in Joey's bedroom, where Matt Moore told the police the evidence will show he slept once he got up in the middle of the night and he had to go to the bathroom. He slept in that bedroom. More bedding. They searched the bathroom, and this is why this is important. The evidence will show, members of jury, and in particular, what was in the hamper in the bathroom, because they searched this too. The evidence will show that the clothing in the hamper is the same clothing that Matt Moore and Emily Moore were wearing on her birthday the night before, when she's last seen. And so what comes of all these searches that were made by law enforcement, not just at Westerville Police Department, but also for BCI&I, the house, the cars, the attic, the clothes, the evidence will show you that there's nothing. There's no blood, there's no tissue, there's no fibers, there's nothing. But the evidence will show it wasn't just people that searched all those places that we just went through. It was also cadaver dogs. Cadaver dogs that the evidence will tell you are trained specifically to come to a scene, a location, and alert when they smell or detect either blood, tissue, or any smell of death. The cadaver dogs, in addition to humans, searched all the areas I just told you about. And what will the evidence show that the cadaver dogs found? Nothing. There's no physical injuries. And when I say physical injuries, I mean to Matt. He calls the 911, as the state has said, on May 25th and reports that his wife is missing. I want to pause there, though. He calls 911, brings the police to his house. As the evidence will show, certainly, that that's what a 911 call does. Common sense tells us that. They get there, and then within 48 hours, they ask my client, Matt, to come down to the police station and give a statement, and he does. He goes to the police station, and when he's there, two of the detectives say, "What about scratches or injuries on you?" The evidence will show that Matt Moore takes off his shirt, not at the direction of the state, but he takes off his shirt. Now, before he takes off his shirt, of course, his face is exposed, and you're going to see a body cam video of Officer Hollis, and you will see what Matt Moore is wearing when the officers arrive. And you'll see which parts of his body are exposed. So he takes off his shirt. Officers lean in. Hands, forearms, chest, neck, face, back, legs. What did they find? Nothing. And consider this evidence, members of the jury, or the lack of evidence, particularly after you went to that wooded area yesterday. The judge is correct to say that your jury view in and of itself is not evidence. But it is, as the judge told you yesterday, something for you to consider when you hear the evidence that's presented. Think about how hard it was to get down there. And I even just wrote what the state said in their opening about that area. It was essentially shrubs and trees, not readily apparent it's even there. Now, members of the jury, again, our statements are not evidence. But what the state says they will give to you to meet their burden, hold them to it. Because as they started this morning, that is their roadmap. So there's no physical injuries on Matt Moore. There's no time of death in this case, members of the jury. The state has alleged, and the judge read you the charges, and the state has just stood up in his opening and said that on May 24th and May 25th of 2020, Matt Moore killed his wife, and then there's also a charge of felonious assault, but there's 2 counts of murder and felonious assault. The dates are the 24th and 25th. There is no witness. There is no expert. There is no police officer. There is no lay witness that can or will give you the time of death. And I remember in voir dire yesterday when I was talking to the veneer about dates and attention span, and I remember saying dates are incredibly important in this case. The dates we know are the date that Emily went missing. The last she was seen is by a neighbor that lives across from 46 Abbey Cross, where you went yesterday. In fact, a neighbor that lives directly across the street. He sees Emily going for a walk that morning in her walking clothes. And we know the evidence will show, evidence that we will present, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we know that he definitely saw Emily on the 25th and not any other day, based on the cell phone evidence. So there is no time of death. We know that Emily went missing on March 25th is when she's last seen by someone other than Matt Moore, and we know that she's found on September 16th. We do not know when she got to the park or how she got to the park, but with respect to time of death, there is no information that the state will offer you as to that at any point in this trial. We will, however, present expert from University of Tennessee, who is a researcher at an institute called the Body Farm. And in fact, it's an expert that the state originally engaged in this case, and then the evidence will show decided not to use after she rendered a report.
Objection. Fair characterization.
Ladies and gentlemen, opening statement is not evidence, so therefore you will not consider statements as evidence to render your decision in this case. Please proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Vivaldi is an expert from the University of Tennessee. She will testify that the most you can tell from the scene, based on her training and expertise and her work studying decaying corpses, is that the body decomposed there and had been there for a while. There is no time frame that even the best expert can put as to where and when Emily got to that scene. Furthermore, not only is there not a time of death, but the evidence will also show that there is no trace of Emily in that wooded area in May or June of 2020. And I want to go over some maps with you, and I know members of the jury, you were there yesterday. I'll start with this. This, as the state just showed you, is the map of the general area. To orient ourselves, this is kind of the general area right here where Emily's found. And as you are walking up that sidewalk, you might remember seeing an electrical box on the ground. That can always orient you in the pictures that you will see. But that's the general area right there where Emily was found. And yesterday, of course, this right here is the bike path, walking path. And this, of course, is County Line Road. I want to talk to you about when I say the evidence will show there's no trace of Emily in the woods or May or June. You are going to hear testimony that on the 25th, when the police arrived at the house, Matt Moore voluntarily said to the police officers, "Let me take you to the area where Emily loved to walk and forage." Where did he take her? Where did he take the police? Right there. Their own officers will have to admit to that Matt, as the evidence will show, walked them along this very line. And then what happened, well, the evidence will show that area, that exact area. In fact, the police will not only concede this during the evidence of this case, but they have all along in this investigation. They searched this area on foot 3 times. 3 times in May and June, and nothing. But like with the house and the car and the attic, it wasn't just humans, because cadaver dogs searched that area too. The evidence will show, and what was found when cadaver dogs went to the area where Matt Moore took the police as Emily's favorite walking path? Nothing. The evidence will also show the individual that lives at that house right there, whose kids play in the back of her house, butts right up to that wooded area, was home all Memorial Day weekend. Whether the weather was warm, the evidence will show. She saw nothing. She smelled nothing. No trace of Emily in the woods in May or June. Furthermore, the evidence will show that there's no evidence that connects Matt Moore to this scene. The state has just promised you that they will give you the testimony of Detective Hollis, and I believe that will happen today, and you will be able to see the body cam of Detective Hollis when he rolls up onto Abbey Cross on May 25th and interacts with Matt Moore. The state in their opening talked to you about this corner of the garage. The Detective Hollis body cam will also show you something else that's interesting, is that in the camera, in the footage, the police are from the beginning telling Matt that he's a suspect, that they know they killed his wife. Right from the beginning. And so why is this important? Is because the evidence will show that if that's what the officers were thinking, that common sense and the evidence supports, they didn't lose sight of that guy. They did not lose sight of him. Not mentioned, but the evidence will show that on May 25th, because not only did they not want to lose sight of him, they didn't want to lose track of him. They put a GPS on his car without him even knowing. Because that's the whole point of a GPS, right? Put it on someone's car so they don't know we're looking or following, so that we could trace their every move at any minute of any day. What did they find from the GPS? Nothing. Further, not only is there no movement from Abbey Cross and Matt to that scene, is that the items found at the scene, forensically, tested, in particular the USB cord that Emily had tied around her neck. What forensics are on the USB cord connecting the cord to Matt? Nothing. Further, there's no eyewitnesses. And I don't just mean eyewitnesses to what they claim is the murder, to the transportation, allegedly, of a body to a wooded area. There's no eyewitnesses to putting a body in there. And members of the jury, again, I say this. I know the judge told you your jury view wasn't evidence, but it's certainly for your consideration. You walked county line. You were able to feel and observe the amount of traffic on that road. You were also able to feel and observe whether there is a place where you can park on that road next to the wooded area. But there's no eyewitnesses. And certainly there was no eyewitness given by the state in their map. There's also members of the jury, the evidence will show no motive. And I know we talked about this yesterday in voir dire, that the state under Ohio law doesn't have to give you motive. And I completely agree with that. I also, though, as the judge will tell you, agree that there is a further instruction, that the absence of motive can be used by you in your determination as to purpose or intent. And the judge will tell you more about that, but it's critically important. Now, in the state's opening, they talked about Emily's bravery and her persistence. Joey, Matt's son, at around the age of 18, hung himself with a cord in a wooded area about 1 mile from Abbey Cross. About 10 months prior to Emily being found in a wooded area with a cord around her neck. There is no question that Joey's death was a suicide. That's what the evidence will show. His death was a suicide. And I remember during voir dire, one of the jurors said, second most common death of juveniles is suicide, and Joey was a victim of that statistic. And the state actually and I will agree that Joey's suicide and hanging was particularly troublesome to both Matt and Emily. Both of them, neither of them could work. Emily took a 3 to 4 months absence from her job. Matt, well, you'll see there's text messages between Emily and Matt. Matt really was at a place in his life where getting up every day and just even doing things of normalcy was well, seemingly impossible. And the evidence will show that. And then the state talked about what Emily did, was that Emily then went to counseling in August of 2019 because of Joey's death. And members of the jury, you will hear that when she goes to counseling, she goes because she is traumatized by the death and loss of Joey. She reports difficulty feeling sad and empty and guilty. She's paranoid about her husband's well-being. She's struggling with loss of interest in activities, with memories. She notes in her therapy that she has a prior history with struggling with anxiety. And members of the jury, the evidence will show she has a history of struggling with anger prior to the loss of her other loved ones. And she's starting to experience depression and notes that she's experienced depression before. The state in its opening talked about Emily's traumatic life. And I say this, there's not a lot of things that the evidence will be agreed upon by both sides in this case, but certainly that's one that I agree. Emily's first husband killed himself by shooting his head in 2011. A year later, in 2012, the evidence will show one of her very good friends killed herself. The evidence will show that. In 2017, her brother-in-law, by marriage, so Mark's brother, kills himself. In 2019, Joey hangs himself in a park from a tree. Trauma is almost an understatement as to what Emily had lived through. There is no question about that. But Joey, her stepson, and again, our openings aren't arguments, but the state said Emily was passionate about Joey. And the evidence will certainly support her passion and love for Joey and what that loss in 2019 did to her, emotionally and physically. And then, members of the jury, at the end of 2019, you will see that she unexpectedly stopped counseling and therapy. And instead, she turned to what Emily knew so well, which was trying to find peace in nature and the woods. She would walk daily, she would forage, she would go into the woods. You will hear that Emily and Matt were kind of a bunch of hippies. They would collect plants, nettles, they would dry them in the garage. You're going to see pictures of this. They canned, they liked to forage for their own food, despite them living in Westerville, Ohio. She went to nature, the evidence will show, to find peace. And of course, it was nature where she was found on September 16th of 2020. Members of the jury, there's also no evidence of staging. I certainly listened to the state's opening that their theory is that Matt kills her, takes her to the wooded area, and then stages her death. And this is why, as you listen to this evidence, I ask you, members of the jury, to really use your common sense. Because the evidence will show that Emily is found in the position where you stood yesterday, under that branch. She's found with her water bottle next to her. Her hair is down. And we know that because the way her hair is matted when she's found. Her hair is down. Hair tie around her wrist. She's in her walking clothes. And hair tie around her wrist, I just say, is because we know that the last person that saw her leaving for a walk. She's in clothing that, as you look closely, right, is clothing that you would wear when you're walking. And you don't even need to look closely because the evidence will show she has her tennis shoes on. Not the shoes or the clothing that she's seen in the night before. And the evidence will show there is no question as to what Matt and Emily were wearing on the night of the 24th, on her birthday, because we have pictures, selfies, that they took of themselves at the bar as they're celebrating her birthday. And here's something else with respect to the evidence will show about about the staging, is that as Emily's found, her right hand is gripping her ankle. You will hear evidence about the difference between a complete hanging and an incomplete hanging. But members of the jury, there is no evidence that that scene was staged. And then lastly, I want to talk about where the state ended. Sort of the last chapter in their book is their experts. I noticed in their opening statement they spoke a lot when they talked about their experts about Dr. Smock. And as you listen to the evidence in this case, the evidence will show that Emily goes missing on the 25th. She's found in September 16th of 20. Almost a year goes by before Matt Moore is charged. Living in this community, out on the street, almost a year. And so what happens, will the evidence show, right before he gets charged? Again, timing is everything. Dr. Smock is engaged by the state and he issues a report. As you listen to the testimony of Dr. Smock, I ask you, members of the juries, to consider three things. First of all, what he relied upon in determining his conclusions. His field of expertise and the opinions that he can and cannot render. Because members of the jury, I heard the state in their opening say, quote, and then please always trust your notes over mine. Dr. Smock will tell you the cause of death was manual strangulation. I ask you, members of the jury, to wait until Dr. Smock's testimony, because the judge will tell you that's what jurors have to do, is to be open-minded and wait till you hear all the evidence. Dr. Smock himself, under oath, will have to agree, and will agree, that he is actually not allowed to offer any opinions with respect to manner and cause of death. Only a medical examiner is allowed to do that. And the evidence will show that the medical examiner in this case, the doctor that actually performed the autopsy on Emily Noble's remains, that the only cause of death that that medical examiner found is that injuries to the head and neck caused her death. Injuries, right? Head and neck caused her death. Now, that's what the evidence won't show. And why I led my opening with, why doesn't the state's case make sense? And while it's not my usual practice, this case is unusual in many ways. And so I will, my opening statement, tell the jury, you, each and every one of you, what the defense will put on as evidence. And I say I don't usually do this because I don't have a burden. I, as Matt Moore's attorney, Matt Moore, Alexander Petrella, have to put on nothing. But we will. In fact, we're going to give you 4 experts and lay witnesses. And here's what a brief overview of what our experts will say. First and foremost, we'll call Dr. Bolte. Biomechanics expert, Dr. Bolte is the director at the Ohio State Biomechanics Research Center. He's an expert in the experimental analysis of human injury tolerance and mechanisms under different loading conditions. Here's the value and what you will hear from Dr. Bolte. Undisputed testimony. And it's undisputed because he went to the scene and tested the branch. And he did so at the request of the state of Ohio. And I say this, members of the jury, the evidence will show, again, jury view, when you went down there yesterday and was shown the branch where Emily was found is quite small. Quite small. Dr. Bolte will come in here and say that actually when he went down there, he, as an expert in biomechanics, thought there's no way this branch can hold. But he did 2 different tests. A static test and a dynamic test. Dr. Bolte will tell you that, and this is on video, you will see the videos. You will not have to imagine this. You will see the tests. First test is he slowly adds weights, increments of weights, to the branch to see if not only will the branch hold, but the rate of deflection of the branch. Static test, branch holds. In fact, the deflection measurement is 2 inches. That's how strong the branch is. Then, after he's tested on the static test, he does a dynamic test. And a dynamic test, the evidence will show, is what happens if someone were to hang themselves and let their weight fall? Could it happen? He takes a crash test dummy, the same weight as Emily Noble, ties a USB cord in the same or similar fashion as Emily tied it around her neck on the 25th of May. It's on video, you will see it. And he takes the crash test dummy and he drops it. That's the branch. Holds her up. We will also give you the testimony of Dr. Heather Garvin, a forensic anthropologist who is board certified. And board certification, the evidence will show, certainly matters. She's one of 100+ individuals in this country who is a board certified forensic anthropologist. And she will talk about what the state said in their opening with respect to the fractures. Most specifically, the state just told you that there's perimortem nasal fractures. Dr. Garvin will say that in her experience, training, and education, that she sees no perimortem nasal fractures. She will also tell you that based on her training, experience, and expertise, that the bilateral fractures that the state just told you about to the greater horns of the hyoid and the bilateral fractures to the superior horns of the hyoid can occur in hangings. Incomplete and complete hangings. Now, members of the jury, you will not hear from Dr. Garvin cause of death, because she cannot testify as to cause of death. Again, only a medical examiner can. But she will tell you about mechanisms of injury. We will also give to you the testimony of Matt Curtin. In the state's opening, I wrote down law enforcement attempts to put together a timeline based on the cell data. We will actually give you a computer scientist who is a cybersecurity expert. All he does is look at cell data and computers and peel back the onion to find what's there. Even when the users want to hide anything and everything. That's who Matt Curtin is. And Matt will tell you 3 really important things that, again, show that the state's theories don't make sense. He'll tell you about phone location history for Matt and Emily on May 24th and 25th. He will tell you about patterns of user activity, or more specifically, he will tell you how there are no patterns because there is not enough data. He will also tell you about the user browser history. All this evidence about how Matt is so sophisticated, staging this whole area. What are his browser history searches? What are Emily's browser history searches leading up? Matt will give you that information. But I tell you this now, the evidence will show there is no browser history about how do you kill someone, how do you hang someone, how do you stage a suicide. Nothing. There is some browser history from Emily about going into the woods to find your soul, though. And then in addition, we will also give you Dr. Vidoli, which I talked about from University of Tennessee. Her entire life's work is studying bodies and their rate of decay and decomposition. In addition to experts, we'll give you some lay witnesses. Again, members of the jury, it's not our burden, but nothing could be more important. And so we will give you the cadaver dog handler. She will come in here and testify and tell you where she searched with her dogs. She will tell you what a cadaver dog is trained to do. She will tell you the expertise and certification of her dogs. And she will tell you that they found nothing. We will give you other testimony. We propose, members of the jury, but I remind you that we have no burden. And maybe it sounds a bit like a broken record that I say that, but there is no such thing when it comes to a case like this. The burden is here. It is the highest burden in the land. This is a criminal case. Reasonable doubt is based on reason and common sense. On behalf of Matt Moore and my co-counsel, I am confident that after you have heard all the evidence, that you will render the appropriate verdicts of not guilty. Thank you so much.
Thank you, counsel. Statement called the first witness.